Get ready to dive into one of the most turbulent periods in American history, the Civil War. Witness how the struggle between North and South not only shaped nations but also defined the destinies of millions. Explore social tensions, bloody battles, and the heroic roles of individuals who fought for justice and freedom. The struggle for emancipation was not just a military struggle, it was a fight for the soul of a nation. Are you ready to discover the stories that changed the course of America? So, let's get started. Before the war, the United States was a nation marked by deep contrasts and divisions. While the North rapidly industrialized, creating an environment of prosperity and urbanization, the South remained predominantly agricultural, based on the cotton economy and strongly linked to the slavery system. Tensions between these two worlds began to intensify in the 1850s, reflecting not only economic interests but also different worldviews. Life on the southern plots was built on an oppressive social hierarchy, where enslaved people were seen more as property than as human beings. Meanwhile, in the North, the abolitionist movement was gaining strength, promoting a fervent debate about human rights and social justice. This seed of division did not just arise from an economic issue, but from ethical dilemmas that began to define the identities of the different regions and that would later culminate in a devastating conflict. The political climate was buzzing with arguments about the morality of slavery, which made peaceful dialogue between states impossible. Conflicts over rights and slavery were fundamental drivers for the start of the Civil War. While abolitionists called for freedom and equality, many in the South argued for maintaining slavery as a constitutional right. This polarization intensified with the passage of laws like the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed new states to decide on their own whether or not to allow slavery. This led to violent clashes in various parts of the country, which became known as Bleeding Kansas. Families were divided, friends became enemies, and the climate of hostility spread like an epidemic. Furthermore, Supreme Court decisions, such as the famous Dred Scott decision, only worsened the situation, stating that black people were not citizens and therefore had no rights that the government was obligated to respect. This ongoing battle between states' rights and the morality of slavery could not be ignored, and it was already clear that what had begun as a political debate was turning into a matter of fighting for the survival of an ideal. In this tense atmosphere, the need for a resolution would become increasingly urgent. Elections in the 1860s were a tumultuous reflection of the socio-political climate in the United States. The presidential election of 1860 emerged as a decisive turning point. The candidates were divided between those who defended the maintenance of the status quo of slavery and those who wanted its abolition. At the center of this dispute was Abraham Lincoln, a name that would become synonymous with hope for many and despair for others. The division between political parties reflected the division of the country, as the Republican Party formed in part to oppose the expansion of slavery. With a campaign focused on union and emancipation, Lincoln managed to win the presidency, even without winning several southern states. This victory was seen as a declarative act against slavery and as a threat to Southern sovereignty. Tensions rose sharply after the election, and territories like South Carolina quickly began to secede from the Union. The result of this election not only sealed Lincoln's fate, but also determined that the nation would be tested on its deepest commitment to freedom and equality. The rise of Abraham Lincoln was not just an electoral event, it was the beginning of a new era of hope and challenge. With victory in the 1860 elections, Lincoln became the first president of the Republican Party, and his position on slavery was clear. He wanted to preserve the Union at all costs. His stance, however, was not well received in the South, where many saw his election as a sign that their rights were under threat. He faced immense pressure and an already divided nation, but, with a strong and decisive character, he focused on keeping the peace and avoiding war. Lincoln attempted, through a variety of approaches, to reinforce the Union, even as states seceded from the Republic. Allying himself with advisors and policymakers, he sought to understand the complexities of tensions between North and South, preparing for a conflict he hoped he could avoid. Thus, even in the midst of division and chaos, Lincoln's leadership emerged as a symbol of hope, foreshadowing that the fight for unity and freedom was yet to come, and that the actions and decisions about to be made would shape the nation's future. Southern secession was a process that began immediately after Lincoln's election. South Carolina, fearing the abolition of slavery, was the first state to secede, doing so in December 1860. Soon after, other states followed suit, creating a wave of secession that spread across the southern region. The idea that each state had the right to decide its own destiny, especially on the issue of slavery, became the mantra of Southern leaders like Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens. They argued that secession was a way to protect their rights and their way of life. With each new declaration of secession, tension between North and South increased. Entire families were divided by this new reality, with members fighting over what was right, defending national unity or seeking state autonomy. Secession was not only changing the political landscape, but also setting the stage for a conflict that would test the convictions of both sides to their limits. The Proclamation of Confederation, which took place in February 1861, was an audacious step by the seceding states, uniting under a new flag as the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis was elected President of the Confederacy, and his leadership was marked by an attempt to create a new government that would oppose Northern control. The Constitution of the Confederacy reinforced rights that protected slavery, reflecting the values that united the Southern states. Davis and other Confederate leaders believed that secession was a legitimate right, an act of self-assertion and resistance against what they saw as the tyranny of the federal government. Over the following months, the Confederation would begin to structure its armed forces and even its economy, aiming for a prolonged duration of the conflict. The creation of the Confederacy not only formalized the division, but also solidified the ideology that the South would fight for its freedom. The economic and social impact of secession was profound and in the South, the agriculture-based economy encountered a new challenge. The Confederate States had a heavy dependence on slave labor, and uncertainty about the possibility of trade with the North began to generate fears. Cotton production, although still the main source of wealth, began to face difficulties and a shortage of imported goods began to be felt. The North, in turn, was preparing for conflict, using its industrialization and railway infrastructure to its advantages. Socially, the division intensified. Many in the South felt aggravated and saw the war as a fight for their own identity, while in the North, the mobilization against slavery began to intensify, uniting different social layers in the name of abolition and union. Divided families, increased recruitment into the army and growing resistance to war marked everyone's lives, reflecting a period of profound transformation for American society. The North's reaction to the South's secession was largely one of shock and disbelief, followed by a determination to preserve the Union. Northern leaders, including Abraham Lincoln, were deeply concerned that secession would spread and threaten the fabric of the country. In response to the declaration of secession and the formation of the Confederacy, Lincoln made emotional appeals to the nation's patriotism, emphasizing that the preservation of the Union was essential to the continuation of the democratic principles that the Founding Fathers had established. From that moment on, the call for national mobilization began to echo on the streets of northern cities. Political meetings, public speeches, and newspaper articles unified the population against the Confederacy. The growing feeling that slavery was a moral issue to be fought brought many abolitionists and ordinary citizens to enlist in the military. Tensions that would soon result in battles and conflicts intensified as the North prepared to confront resistance from the Confederate States. Aware that a civil war was inevitable, the Battle of Fort Sumter, which took place in April 1861, marked the official beginning of the American Civil War. The fort, located in Charleston Bay, South Carolina, was a symbol of the Union and therefore a clear target for the Confederates, who had already seceded from the nation. The fort's commander, Robert Anderson, found himself isolated and surrounded by Confederate forces under the command of General Pete Beauregard. Despite Lincoln's diplomatic efforts to avoid an armed confrontation, increasing pressure on the Confederate government to capture the fort led to a decisive attack. On the morning of April 12, Confederate cannons began firing, marking the beginning of open hostility between the North and South. The bombardment lasted nearly 34 hours, resulting in Anderson's surrender. This event not only unified the Southern states behind the defense of their newly formed Confederacy, but also managed to galvanize the North, making it evident that war could not be avoided and that a fight to preserve the Union was about to begin. The effect of the Battle of Fort Sumter on Union troops was immediate and profound. The news of the fort's surrender had an impact on the morale of the troops and the general public. Many citizens in the North who had been hesitant to support military intervention now saw the urgent need to act. In response to the Confederate attack, President Lincoln called for a contingent of 75,000 volunteers, receiving a widespread wave of patriotism that crossed the North. Men from all parties enlisted in record numbers, many of them driven by a strong sense of duty to the nation and the cause of freedom. However, there was also a feeling of apprehension, the realization that the war could be more brutal and bloody than anyone imagined. As troops prepared to fight, small groups of soldiers began to organize, and communities turned into support centers where families discussed animatedly about what the war would mean for their future. This new commitment sparked a desire for training and strategies, knowing that the fight to preserve the Union would require more than emotional determination. As the conflict began, strategists from the North and South began to shape their tactics and approaches for what would be an unprecedented confrontation. In the North, General Winfield Scott, still an iconic pre-war figure, developed the Anaconda Plan, a strategy that aimed to suffocate the Confederacy through a naval blockade and the capture of key cities such as New Orleans, cutting off their supply routes. He emphasized the importance of a war of attrition, where the North would use its industrial and population superiority to its advantage. On the other hand, Southern leaders such as Robert E. Lee emphasized the need for a war of movement and the advantages of fighting on one's own territory. They sought to exploit the North's weaknesses, knowing they did not have such vast resources. Lee's tactics, based on speed and surprise, were often effective, utilizing knowledge of local geography to defeat larger forces. Both sides were quickly learning that the war would not just be a matter of weapons and numbers, but rather of strategy, leadership, and the determination of every soldier involved. The beginning of the brutality of the war became evident shortly after the Battle of Fort Sumter, with the first fighting showing the terrible side of the conflict. As the fighting spread, the North and South soon experienced their first bloody battles. In July 1861, the Battle of Bull Run or Manassas pitted troops on both sides in a confrontation that disillusioned many in the North who had expected an easy victory. The battle, which culminated in a defeat for Union troops, exposed a lack of preparation and inexperience, but it would also reveal the tenacity of Confederate soldiers. The battlefield, stained with blood and tears, became a symbol of the brutality of war and the high casualty count to be expected from that moment on. War strategies began to be tested in the inhumane conditions of the field, and, as the battles intensified, both sides realized that the fight for their own survival and opposing ideologies would be marked by a brutality that would surpass anything they had experienced until then. The Battle of Antietam, fought in September 1862, would become one of the bloodiest clashes of the American Civil War, marking a pivotal point in the conflict. Located at Antietam Creek in Maryland, this battle was an effort by Robert E. Lee to bring the war to the North and encourage Northern states to join the Confederacy. Union forces, under the command of General George McClellan, faced Lee's Confederate troops in a fierce fight that resulted in more than 22,000 people being killed or wounded in a single day. Despite being technically a draw, the battle had a great psychological impact. In its wake, Abraham Lincoln decided to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, transforming the war into a fight for the liberation of the enslaved. The Battle of Gettysburg, which took place in July 1863, determined the course of the war. It was a monumental strategic battle, where Union forces, led by General George Meade, managed to repel Lee's army in one of the most decisive engagements. The result marked a turning point, bringing renewed hope to the North and depleting the resources of the South. Both battles demonstrated not only the brutality but also the high human cost of a war with no end in sight. The civil wars and their battles not only damaged the country's infrastructure, but also led to the loss of countless lives and the oblivion of many unsung heroes. From young soldiers, many of whom enlisted just to defend what they believed was their home, to battle leaders who died fighting for their convictions, the human sacrifice was immense. For example, the common soldier, like William H. Smith, who fought bravely in the Battle of Antietam, became just another name on a list of the dead. This pattern was repeated in countless other soldiers who, despite their heroic actions, were not recognized or remembered in history. Heroes like Union Joshua Chamberlain and Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, on the other hand, had their legacies preserved. However, it is essential to remember that for every famous figure, thousands of other stories of bravery, sacrifice, and tragedy remain obscure. These lost, often forgotten lives are the true essence of the brutality of war. reflecting the pain and struggle that define the human condition in times of conflict. The military tactics used during the Civil War were often innovative and reflected the evolution of modern warfare. The use of railroads to move troops quickly, the deployment of telegraph operators to coordinate real-time communication, and the use of trenches for protection became commonplace on the battlefield. The North, with its industrial advantages, was able to produce more advanced firearms, such as the repeating rifle, which changed the way battles were fought. Additionally, military engineers began to develop new fortifications and siege techniques, as seen at the Battle of Vicksburg, where control of the Mississippi River was enthusiastically sought. However, as tactics evolved, rapid warfare was at odds with the fierce resistance they encountered. The combination of modern warfare technology and soldiers' determination often resulted in a massacre, leading to long, bloody battles. Thus, the military tactics of the time not only shaped the present of warfare, but also influenced the future of armed conflicts around the world, setting precedents that would resonate for generations. The evolution of modern warfare within the context of the American Civil War presented aspects of innovation that transformed the understanding of combat. Emerging technologies such as railroads, telegraphy, and advanced artillery drastically changed military strategies. The use of observation balloons for aerial reconnaissance, for example, was an innovation that allowed generals to obtain information about the positioning of enemy troops. Furthermore, the introduction of rifled core cannons presented much greater accuracy compared to previous models. The impact of this progress was felt in decisive battles, where speed and communication played a crucial role. The concept of total war began to take shape, when not only the armed forces but the civilian population also became targets, reflecting the brutality and scope of modern warfare. This phenomenon transformed the notion of combat and caused nations to rethink their strategies and preparations for future conflicts. Ultimately, the American Civil War established a cycle of change that would become the basis of what we would know as modern warfare, where technology, logistics, and morality intertwine in complex ways. Field experiences during the Civil War were marked by an intense mix of adrenaline and terror. When soldiers arrived on the battlefield, they faced a reality very different from what they imagined. The deafening noise of explosions, the smell of gunpowder, and the sight of blood became part of everyday life. Between moments of clarity and despair, men like William H. Smith lived through experiences that would change their lives forever. Amidst the chaos, a strange camaraderie emerged among the soldiers, united by a common fight. Battlefields were often adorned with improvisations, from log barricades to canvas tents that served as temporary barracks. Time, which seemed to stagnate, also brought with it long hours of waiting, where conversations revolved around memories of life before the war, the families left behind, and the desire for survival. Despite the brutality, unexpected bonds blossomed there that would give meaning to shared suffering, creating memories that would last even after the end of the war. The bonds of friendship that formed between the soldiers were a powerful testament to the human spirit in times of crisis. Amid the penury and horror, figures like Thomas and James became inseparable, sharing the emotional burden of war as they fought side by side. Their connection began on a cold night, around a campfire, where they both shared their stories and hopes. These moments of vulnerability created a strong bond that transcended the difficulties faced on the battlefield. As they exchanged nervous laughs to ease the tension, they knew that at any moment, their destinies could change forever. Soldiers often defended each other in combat, knowing their comrades' weaknesses and abilities. In the midst of battle, it was this friendship that inspired courage, leading them to risk their lives to protect those they had become like brothers. The war may have separated many families, but the friendships forged in the trenches created new families, bringing them together in adversity like never before. Stories of bravery and sacrifice emerged from the battlefields of the American Civil War, each more moving than the last. Soldiers like Joshua Chamberlain, who led the defense of Little Round Top during the Battle of Gettysburg, became icons for their heroic actions. Chamberlain, realizing the numerical disadvantage of his troops, decided to wield the infamous bayonet charge, a daring maneuver that saved his position and made his forces legendary. But it wasn't just the officers who performed incredible feats. Many private soldiers, like young Samuel, a simple farmer from Ohio, risked everything to rescue a brother who had been injured in the field. Reports of courage and brotherly love spread quickly among the troops, providing a spark of hope even in the darkest of times. These stories, although true, were often embellished in narratives, being remembered for years as symbols of indomitable bravery, highlighting that, at the heart of the brutality of war, there existed an unparalleled capacity for sacrifice and loyalty. The emotional impact of war on soldiers was profound and lasting, affecting their lives in ways that went far beyond the battlefield. Many faced mental health issues that we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, but which at the time were just nightmare visions and unexplained anxieties. Soldiers like William H. Smith, after seeing their comrades fall alongside them, fought not only against enemies on the battlefield, but also against demons within. Returning home did not mean relief. Emotional repercussions of traumatic memories followed them, often turning once robust, lively men into shadows of their former selves. The struggle to reintegrate into civil society was brutal, as the expectations of their family and friends often conflicted with the internal reality they lived. Furthermore, the devastation of war caused profound loss in communities, where many faced the pain of homesickness and the void left by the sacrifice of their loved ones. This emotional impact reverberated across generations, creating legacies of pain and resilience that would continue to affect American culture for years to come. Harriet Tubman was a striking and inspiring figure during the American Civil War, known mainly for her role as one of the leaders of the Underground Railroad, a clandestine network that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. Tubman, born in captivity, knew firsthand the brutalities of the slavery system and decided to dedicate her life to fighting this injustice. Utilizing her abilities to sneak through plantations and navigate the countryside, she undertook countless missions, saving hundreds of people from slavery. His courage was remarkable. Not only did she return to the South in search of other enslaved people, but she also risked being captured and suffering severe punishment. In 1863, Tubman became the first woman to lead an armed expedition during the Civil War, the famous raid on Combahee River, which resulted in the freeing of more than 700 enslaved people. Her determination and resilience made her a hero not only to African Americans, but also to everyone fighting for justice and equal rights. Harriet Tubman became not just a symbol of resistance, but a force for change who, even in times of war, lit the way to freedom and hope. The call for the emancipation of enslaved people echoed across the country during the years leading up to the Civil War. In the North, abolitionist activists were increasingly articulate, organizing marches, debates, and publications to raise public awareness about the cruelties of slavery. The desire for freedom gained new strength, especially among the growing African American population who experienced oppression on a daily basis. The voices of figures like Frederick Douglass resonated, highlighting that emancipation was not just a political issue, but a moral demand. Douglass and other activists helped rally support among Northern whites by emphasizing that the fight for freedom for the enslaved was actually a fight for dignity and universal human rights. Pressure built in an ever-widening circle, culminating in a fervent demand that the government change its stance on slavery. The collectively growing sentiment in favor of emancipation came to a head when Lincoln, recognizing that the war could not be won without addressing the issue of slavery, found himself compelled to act, thus ushering in a new chapter in American history, one that promised not only liberation but the redefinition of the nation as a whole. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Abraham Lincoln on January 1, 1863, was a crucial milestone in the American Civil War, transforming the focus of the conflict from a mere fight to preserve the Union to a battle for freedom. The proclamation declared that all enslaved people in states in rebellion against the Union should be freed. Although the measure did not have an immediate effect on the liberation of all African Americans, it was a bold statement that signaled a new moral purpose to the war. The repercussions were significant. The measure not only helped dismantle the slave system, but also encouraged many African Americans to enlist in Union forces, allowing them to fight for their own freedom. Freedmen who joined the army brought skills and determination, contributing valuably to the Northern cause. Furthermore, the proclamation influenced German and international public opinion, challenging assise-part interventions from other countries, which were hesitant to support a nation that still permitted slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation not only changed the course of the war, but also advanced the idea of equality and freedom, shaping the future of America and its commitment to human rights. The consequences of the Emancipation Proclamation were felt deeply among African American soldiers, many of whom had been enslaved before the war. Their inclusion in Union troops not only symbolized a change in legal status, but also represented a chance to fight and defend a cause that was inextricably linked to their own freedom. Soldiers like Robert Smalls, who, before the war, had commanded a ship as a slave and now led decisive battles, quickly became emblematic figures of courage and resistance. However, difficulties abounded. Many faced discrimination and undervaluation within the army, where their contributions were often disregarded. Furthermore, even after the proclamation, the path to true emancipation was still tortuous. The fight against racial prejudice and for equality in a predominantly white army tested the resolve of African American soldiers. However, as they advanced on the battlefront, the courage these men demonstrated helped change society's perception of African Americans, challenging stigmas and proving their ability to not only fight, but lead. The presence and deeds of African American soldiers in the Civil War began to take root for the civil rights struggle that would become more prominent in the following decades, solidifying their role as agents of change in American history. As the American Civil War dragged on, setbacks for Union troops became increasingly evident, defying the belief that victory would be quick and easy. After the first conflicts, battles such as the Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862 revealed the brutality and complexity of war. The Union Army was massacring, losing thousands of soldiers in a frontal attack against Confederate fortifications, demonstrating a lack of leadership and effective strategic planning. Furthermore, many recruits from the northern ranks were inexperienced and disorganized, facing battles in unfamiliar terrain and under adverse conditions. The setbacks were not only tactical but also emotional. Troop morale was shaken and the feeling of camaraderie was often threatened. Each defeat generated distrust in Lincoln's leadership and military high command, while anti-war formations became bold, calling for an immediate end to hostilities. This not only increased the polarization between North and South, but also generated a clamor for changes at the top of the army, where many began to demand more competent leaders and a new perspective on warfighting. Voices demanding reforms began to manifest themselves within the ranks, resulting in the urgent need to reevaluate the Union's military strategy. The economic impact of the Civil War became evident to both sides, but it was especially devastating to the South, whose already weakened infrastructure was collapsing as the conflict continued. While the North grew stronger economically, taking advantage of its industrialization, the South faced shortages of essential goods, from food to ammunition, exacerbating hunger and poverty among the civilian population. The naval blockade that the Union imposed made trade even more difficult, and cotton production, which had previously been the South's economic base, was drastically reduced. Paradoxically, the war also awakened a spirit of solidarity and resistance among the Southern people, who united in support of the Confederate cause. But the long-awaited victory seemed increasingly distant. Morally, on both sides, internal conflicts arose. Many Union soldiers began to question the ethics behind the war, especially as they saw the sacrifice of innocent lives under such terrible conditions. Stories of horrors and suffering, which were previously forgotten, now permeated the letters that soldiers sent home. Civil society began to feel the effects of the war in their daily lives, with many families suffering losses and sacrificing their resources in the name of the war effort. Over time, both morality and economics became intertwined, proving to be one of the greatest challenges facing the nation. As the war prolonged, calls for peace also began to emerge. Amid the growing economic and emotional strain on troops and the civilian population, confederations of citizens, community leaders, and public figures began to take the floor, calling for a resolution to the conflict that seemed endless. In several parts of the North, pacifist movements began to gain strength, aiming to encourage peace treaties that could end the carnage and reach an understanding between the states. In the midst of so much loss and suffering, many wanted to envision a future without the specter of war hanging over homes and families, where division could be healed. Influential figures in the North, such as former President Millard Fillmore and abolitionist Horace Greeley, publicly expressed their opinions in favor of seeking negotiations with the South, even if it meant giving up some demands. On the Confederate side, many also expressed discontent with the prolongation of the confrontation, as local officials saw their communities devastated and troop morale deteriorate. Although the idea of peace might seem like a light at the end of the tunnel, The resistance of both sides to compromise on fundamental issues such as the maintenance of slavery and the sovereignty of states made reconciliation even more complicated and distant. As the war progressed, small strategic victories for the Union began to emerge, making Union victories seem possible. The Battle of Vicksburg in July 1863 stood out as one of the significant turning points in the conflict. After a prolonged siege, Union troops, under the command of General Ulysses S. Grant, managed to capture the city, securing control over the Mississippi River and effectively dividing the Confederate states into two parts. This triumph not only boosted the morale of Union troops, but also exposed the vulnerability of Southern forces. On the political front, Lincoln began to gain increasing support for his policies, and the North's determination to complete the task of unifying the nation grew day by day. As more and more African American soldiers enlisted in the Union forces, their contributions began to be recognized, serving as an engine of change and courage. Encouraging the fight for equality and freedom became part of the war narrative, expanding the base of support for the Union cause. However, difficulties were still omnipresent, and the prospect of total victory would require an intense struggle. Overcoming previous setbacks was a testament to the indomitable spirit of both commanders and soldiers, setting the stage for a final clash that would knock on the door of a nation on the brink of defining its future. The Siege of Petersburg began in June 1864 and unfolded as one of the longest and bloodiest sieges of the Civil War. Union forces, led by General Ulysses S. Grant, took the initiative to surround the strategically important city of Petersburg, Virginia, where railroad lines and infrastructure will sustain the Confederate Army's resources. Grant knew that by capturing Petersburg, he would be in a position to isolate Richmond, the Confederate capital. The siege quickly became a game of attrition, with continuous fighting and skirmishes as Confederate troops under the command of General Robert E. Lee tried to hold out. Civilian families who remained in the city lived in desperate conditions due to food rationing and constant bombings. Daily battles resulted in heavy losses on both sides, but Grant's determination to weaken Lee was unwavering. The siege became a symbol of the Union's resilience, and over time it turned into a war of attrition that tested every man and woman involved, setting the stage for the eventual fall of Richmond and the collapse of the Confederate effort. The fall of Richmond in April 1865 was a decisive and emotional milestone in the American Civil War. After months of siege of Petersburg, Grant's troops finally broke through the Confederate lines, forcing Lee and his men to abandon the capital. The atmosphere in the city was a mix of despair and chaos. Many citizens fled for safety as Confederate soldiers prepared to face the final rush of Union forces. The evacuation of Richmond became a scene of desolation, with buildings on fire, reflecting the collapse of the Confederate dream. Grant, on the other hand, saw the capture of the capital not only as a military victory but also as a step toward healing the nation. The entry of Union troops into the city was met with mixed feelings, applause from some and lamentations from others. The fall of Richmond, loaded with symbolism, not only confirmed the South's defeat, but also foreshadowed the historic change that Great Britain awaited. The battle may be coming to an end, but the emotional and physical toll of the war would leave deep scars on both sides. Lee's surrender took place on April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, where one of the most prominent Confederate leaders finally accepted his defeat. After months of grueling combat and the pressures of the Siege of Petersburg and the abandonment of Richmond, Robert E. Lee realized that continuing the fight would be futile. The meeting with General Grant was a moment full of tension, but also of mutual respect. Lee's request that his troops be able to return home with dignity was welcomed by Grant, who understood the importance of a humane closure to this traumatizing war. The signing of the surrender not only sealed the fate of the Confederate Army, but also became a symbol of a new beginning for the devastated nation. Lee and his men could return to their families, beginning a healing process. With Lee's surrender, it became apparent that the war was falling apart, and the idea of a unified future, although fraught with challenges, was slowly emerging on the horizon. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln on April 14, 1865, just days after Lee's surrender, was a brutal act that shocked the nation and caused deep mourning. The president was attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., when John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer, entered and fired a fatal shot at his head. News of the murder spread quickly, triggering a wave of horror and disbelief. Lincoln had been a leader who guided the country through one of the most challenging periods in American history, and his brutal death weakened the spirit of the Union that was beginning to come together again. The assassination not only burdened the nation with grief, but also heightened social and political tensions, as many feared that his death would cause reversals of progressive actions toward emancipation and civil rights. The country that so eagerly yearned for healing and unity now found itself facing a new crisis, reflecting the complexity of the struggle for freedom. Lincoln's assassination not only momentarily halted dreams of a new beginning, but also emphasized the fragility of peace and justice in times of transition. The immediate consequences of Abraham Lincoln's assassination were felt across the country. The nation, which had hoped to enter a period of healing and reconstruction after the war ended, was suddenly thrown into deep mourning. Lincoln was seen as a strong and visionary leader who provided a difficult but necessary path to emancipation and the restoration of the Union. His death left a leadership vacuum, and many feared that the achievements of recent years could be reversed. In the capital, the reaction was quick. Tensions increased between the radicals who wanted harsh treatment for the South and the moderates who advocated the elaboration of a peace dialogue. The assassination also catalyzed a wave of sympathy and solidarity among the northern states, uniting them in a common resistance against Confederate sympathizers. For many African Americans, Lincoln's death was a tragedy not only for the loss of a president, but for a defender of freedom who had promised to fight tirelessly for their rights. City streets across the country were filled with mourning crowds, reflecting the emotional impact Lincoln had on the American people, regardless of color or origin. As the country recovered from the shock, the future seemed increasingly uncertain and cloudy. With Lincoln's death, the social and political changes that were already underway intensified and became increasingly urgent. The fight for emancipation and civil rights gained new momentum among activists and members of the clergy, who saw the need to transform military victory into permanent guarantees of freedom. Congress, dominated by radical Republicans, began to formulate a series of laws that aimed not only at protecting the rights of former slaves, but also at social restructuring in the South. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 sought to guarantee equal rights to all citizens, representing a milestone in the fight for racial equality. Tensions in the South, where many whites were still reluctant to accept change, began to erupt into racial violence and organized resistance. Many formerly enslaved people were elected to public office, an unprecedented development that caused great uproar and resistance in white communities. At the same time, the politics of Reconstruction became a battleground in itself, with opponents disputing the meaning of freedom and citizenship. Social changes, driven by new laws and reforms, created a new space for a broader debate about American identity that was still far from resolved. Reconstruction of the South after the Civil War was a monumental effort that involved economic, social, and political challenges. Once thriving plantations were devastated, and the economy suffered considerably, resulting in unprecedented poverty in the region. For many liberated African Americans, the hope of a new life was paired with the reality that, even free, they faced scarcity of resources, limited opportunities, and prejudice. To restore the Southern economy, the federal government implemented Reconstruction policies, which included building schools and creating assistance programs in several areas. The role of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands was crucial in helping reintegrate African Americans into society by offering education and economic support. However, resistance from many whites who did not accept the new equality guidelines led to an increase in racial tensions and the formation of organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan. These groups initially re-emerged as a force opposing reform and integration, using intimidation tactics to ensure that the old social order remained intact. The South, therefore, became trapped in a cycle of violence and restructuring that would make Reconstruction one of the most troubled periods in American history. The post-war struggle for civil rights was a protracted battle, stirring ideals and aspirations that continued to evolve over time. Although the Emancipation Proclamation and the changes of Reconstruction advanced the fight for equality, the reality of discrimination and oppression was still present. The rights of African Americans were systematically undermined in many southern states through black codes, which restricted their freedoms and denied basic rights such as voting and working freely. Resistance to oppression and the fight for justice began to emerge in public and private spheres. with leaders such as Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth rising up to call for justice and equality. In response to Southern hostility, two forms of resistance flourished: grassroots movements that encouraged organization and solidarity among the formerly enslaved, and continued support from the North to demand rights. Viewed as a threat by many, the civil rights movement established itself as an emerging mission as the 19th century progressed, laying the groundwork for modern activism that would culminate in significant changes to systems of oppression in the decades that followed. The struggle would one day finally be personified in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, meaning that the battle for equality, while tough, was a legacy of perseverance and resilience that would continue to shape the American nation. The perspectives of Union leaders during the American Civil War were shaped by a number of complex factors, including the urgency to preserve the nation and growing moral awareness regarding slavery. Figures such as Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, and William Tecumseh Sherman, each in their own way, understood that war was not just a military issue, but a fight for the principles of freedom and justice. Lincoln, in particular, emphasized the importance of preserving the Union as a moral and political imperative, inspiring him to press forward even in the face of challenges and defeats on the battlefield. Grant and Sherman, in turn, adopted strategies of total war, recognizing the need to destroy not only Confederate military forces, but also the infrastructure that supported their economies. This approach, although criticized for its brutality, was seen as a way to hasten the conflict's conclusion. Thus, Union leaders articulated not only military objectives, but also visions of a unified and egalitarian America that would guide their efforts and decisions during and after the war. The stories of Confederate generals are a fascinating testament to the complexity and emotional depth associated with the American Civil War. Robert E. Lee, one of the most respected Confederate leaders, emerged as a charismatic figure, symbolizing the bravery and determination of the South. His strategic approach, which emphasized mobility and defense within his territory, brought early victories but also led to heavy losses in subsequent battles. Another prominent general, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, was known for his daring tactics and unshakable faith, which made him a military icon. However, defeats and difficulties on the battlefield, coupled with increasing pressure for a decisive victory, created moral and military dilemmas that questioned the viability of the Confederate effort. Leaders like Lee and Jackson, admired for their tactical skill, also faced internal conflicts, dealing with pressure from their respective troops and their own conscience about human rights in such a devastating war. These stories reveal that even on one side of the divide, there are nuances that humanize the experience of everyone who was at war. The role of women during the American Civil War was multifaceted and transformative, challenging social norms and expanding the definition of what it meant to be a woman in American society. Many women, such as Clara Barton and Dorothea Dix, became active in humanitarian aid, organizing relief efforts and caring for wounded soldiers on the battlefields, defying traditional restrictions that confined them to domestic roles. Furthermore, the participation of women in the abolitionist cause, such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, helped shape public consciousness about the brutality of slavery. Many women also took on responsibilities previously considered masculine, taking care of business and agricultural sectors while their husbands were at the front. This shift not only helped make the war effort viable, but also paved the way for later feminist movements as these women experienced a sense of agency and empowerment. The role of women was, therefore, not just a support for the war effort, but a true social revolution that reformulated female identity in the years following the war. After the war, the reconstruction of American identity became an urgent necessity. The nation found itself divided not only geographically but also emotionally, as citizens tried to reconcile the horrors and losses of war with the hope and promise of a unified future. The period known as Reconstruction addressed fundamental issues such as the rights of formerly enslaved people and the reintegration of Southern states into the Union. These social transformations required a re-evaluation of American identities, where the concept of freedom began to expand, incorporating the ideal of equal rights. The struggle for emancipation, which became an integral part of national identity, challenged the old racial and social hierarchy. However, the resistance and retaliation of many Southerners, the formation of racist groups and segregationist policies showed that the divisions would not be easily overcome. Thus, The question of post-war American identity evolved amid struggles and challenges, reflecting a nation in search of a new sense of belonging and a real commitment to the ideals that founded it. The press played a pivotal role during the American Civil War, shaping public opinion in profound and lasting ways. With the novelty of real-time coverage of military events, newspapers and magazines began reporting not only the battles, but also the personal stories of soldiers and families affected by the war. Publications such as the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune disseminated information about victories and defeats, promoting a feeling of unity among the citizens of the North. Additionally, recruitment posters, advertisements, and editorials instigated reflection on ethical issues such as slavery, presenting the North's struggle as a moral battle. With the rise of war correspondence, readers were able to witness the horror of battles and the realities of combat, creating an emotional bond between soldiers in the field and the civilian population. This dynamic resulted in more intense activism within abolitionist ranks and an increase in recruitment, while also contributing to an increasingly critical perception of the brutality of the war. The press was not just a source of information. It was a powerful engine of mobilization and social change that shaped debates about freedom and equality during and after the conflict. Accounts from the battlefield during the American Civil War were stunning and often devastating. Soldiers, in letters and diaries, described not only the horrors they faced, but also their hopes and fears as they fought for causes that often seemed beyond their control. One example is the correspondence of William H. Smith, a Union soldier, who in his writings highlighted the chaos and losses he witnessed at the Battle of Antietam. He spoke of his comrades falling to his side and the fight not only against the Confederates but also against the desolation that war brought. These accounts became a powerful form of testimony, humanizing the cold numbers and statistics that were often presented in newspapers. Historically, these writings allowed the public to view war not only through the lens of leaders and generals, but also from the perspective of ordinary soldiers, who expressed their feelings of longing, despondency, and the camaraderie they developed. While they could often be personal tragedies, these narratives also showed a deep sense of duty and courage that manifested itself in the midst of destruction, helping to shape the collective memory of the war and its lessons for the future. The impact of photographs during the American Civil War cannot be underestimated. They provided a new visual language that triggered almost instantaneous emotions and reactions in society. Through the work of photographers like Matthew Brady, images of battlefields and wounded soldiers were disseminated on an unprecedented scale. These photographs were not only records of events, but also a powerful means of communication that conveyed the severity and brutality of the conflict. Images of fallen soldiers, overcrowded camps, and the aftermath of war were displayed on the pages of mass publications, allowing the public a direct view of the fighting. The effect was profound, as many citizens who might have written off the war as distant or romantic now found themselves confronted with the brutal reality of death and suffering. This helped galvanize public opinion against slavery and in favor of the war effort, while also sparking debates about the morality of the war itself. The photographs served as a constant visual reminder of the lives being lost and the reality of the struggle for freedom, transforming the perception of war into something more tangible and human. Cultural influences in the post-war era were profound and multifaceted, reflecting the complexities of the legacy of the American Civil War. With the end of the conflict, the nation took charge of redefining its identity and values, leading to a flowering of new cultural, artistic, and social ideas. The civil rights movement began to form, based on the still unfinished struggle for racial equality and the emancipation of African Americans. This cultural impulse was also reflected in the literature of the time, with authors such as Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson exploring themes of war, death, and the quest for freedom in their works. The visual arts also recognized the scars of the conflict, evidenced in paintings and sculptures that paid homage to war heroes and addressed harsh realities of civilian life after the war. Theater and music also became popular ways to express the need for healing and reconciliation, while new forms of entertainment, such as vaudeville, gained popularity. The yearning for a new beginning and the reconstruction of society permeated cultural influences, creating an atmosphere of change and hope. Thus, the post-war era became not only a time of adaptation, but also a starting point for future struggles for justice and equality in the United States. The Reconstruction policies that emerged after the American Civil War were fundamental in trying to restore the Union and heal the wounds left by the conflict. With the end of the war, federal leadership faced the monumental challenge of reintegrating the Southern states, which had in 1865, the implementation of President Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction Program began, which sought to allow a rapid reintegration of the Confederate states. However, without strict conditions, this approach met with resistance in Congress, where many were concerned about the reinstatement of former Confederate leaders and the plight of the formerly enslaved. So, in response, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which divided the South into 5 military districts and required states to adopt new constitutions guaranteeing equal rights to African Americans. These measures sought to ensure civil and political protection in freed communities, although enforcement of the laws was met with fierce resistance from many whites in the South, who saw their authority being abolished and opposed the idea of racial equality. Despite the challenges faced, these policies were a crucial attempt to restructure Southern society and promote a sense of justice, establishing a legacy that would echo in civil rights debates for decades to come. Civil rights and the 13th Amendment became emblematic of the fight for justice and equality after the end of the Civil War. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, formally abolished slavery, a monumental step that promised, in theory, total freedom to all formerly enslaved people. However, legal emancipation did not immediately translate into real equality. The voices of the struggle for civil rights began to emerge, with activists demanding not only freedom, but also access to education, work, and political rights. The 14th Amendment was introduced in 1868, guaranteeing citizenship and equal protection under the law for all people born in the United States, an important step in challenging long-standing racial hierarchies. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, granted the right to vote to men, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, trying to ensure the political participation of African Americans. Despite these achievements, resistance soon manifested itself through local legislation and violent actions that aimed to restrict these rights, revealing that the fight for equality was just beginning. The amendments became symbols of hopes and challenges that would shape the future of civil rights across segments of American society, establishing a tortuous path toward full equality. The resistance groups that emerged in the South after the Civil War reflected social tensions and vigorous opposition to African American emancipation and Reconstruction policies. One of the most infamous organizations was the Ku Klux Klan, formed in 1866. The Klan positioned itself as a secret society that advocated white supremacy and promoted acts of violence and intimidation against African Americans and their supporters. The use of violent tactics such as lynchings, burnings, and assaults created a climate of fear that aimed to restore the old social order. In addition to the Klan, other groups such as the Chevaliers and Redeemers also emerged, promising to restore the Old South, acting in defense of the old social structure. Many of these groups have infiltrated various social spheres, including politics, and contributed to the wave of discriminatory laws intended to dismantle the achievements associated with civil rights. The federal government was forced to formulate actions to respond to this resistance, resulting in police actions and legislation that sought to protect the new rights of African Americans, but which were often undermined by the organized violence of these groups. The presence and active activity of resistance organizations was a cruel reminder that the fight for racial equality and civil rights would be long and complicated. Racial tensions during the Reconstruction process were deep and often explosive, reflecting the conflict between new ideologies of equality and the resistance of many Southern whites who viewed emancipation as a direct threat to their way of life. After the Civil War, interaction between whites and African Americans became fertile ground for the resurgence of hostility and prejudice. Attempts to reintegrate formerly enslaved people, who sought not only civil rights but also dignity and opportunities, were often frustrated by an environment steeped in racism and segregation. The emergence of advanced levels of abolition was intensely contested through acts of violence. Events in several Southern cities, where groups such as the Klan carried out attacks on African Americans and even allies of the civil rights movement, were testaments to the fierce resistance to change. Racial laws, known as black codes, attempted to restrict the freedom of African Americans, reversing gains made during Reconstruction. However, the fight for civil rights also found strength in many African Americans and their white allies, who challenged established norms and sought peaceful dialogue. The social field became a battlefield for defining the American political and social future, where racial tensions would shape debates, idols, and movements that would follow one another for decades to come, forming a legacy that would still resonate in contemporary society. The construction of memorials and monuments related to the American Civil War played a crucial role in shaping collective memory and the way society deals with the legacy of the conflict. These monuments not only honor those who fought, but also reflect how different groups interpret history and its consequences. For example, the Lincoln Monument in Washington, D.C., is a symbol of unity in the fight for freedom, capturing the spirit of Lincoln as a leader and defender of emancipation. However, many monuments have been erected in honor of Confederate figures, such as the Stonewall Jackson Monument and the General Robert E. Lee Monument, which evoke an interpretation of the war more focused on Southern resistance. The controversy surrounding these monuments raises debates about the glorification of certain aspects of history, revealing how the struggle for narratives and identities continues. Thus, the memory of the Civil War is not only a reminder of the horrors of the past, but also an ongoing battleground over the meaning of freedom, equality, and American identity today. The war left profound marks on American popular culture, influencing literature, cinema, music, and the visual arts. From epic novels like John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, which, although written in a different context, resonated with echoes of African American struggle for dignity, to films like Django Unchained, which addressed the brutality of slavery and the search for justice. The Civil War and its repercussions are recurring themes. Furthermore, folk music and protest songs have often explored the emotions linked to conflict, evoking feelings of resistance and resilience. Media coverage of events during the war also directly influenced public perception, and the era was marked by the emergence of war journalism, which later evolved into a central element of culture. Within this legacy, the war collectively shaped American identity and continues to reverberate in contemporary narratives that seek to explore issues of racism, freedom, and human rights. The Civil War's impact on education was vast and multifaceted, contributing to an overhaul of the way history and civic rights were taught in American schools. With the end of the conflict, an urgent demand for inclusion in school curricula arose, especially with regard to the history of slavery, the struggle for emancipation, and the rights of African Americans. The teaching of history became a vehicle for discussing not only the events and figures of war, but also the values of freedom and equality. Textbooks began to incorporate more comprehensive narratives, often driven by the writings and accounts of African Americans. Forms of community education also emerged, such as schools for freedmen, which sought to provide basic instruction and skill development. This lasting impact on education not only shaped the practice of teaching history in schools, but also planted the seeds for broader movements for educational reform and equality that would continue to flourish in the decades to come. Oral histories have emerged as a vital means of preserving the memory of the Civil War and its repercussions over time. When captured, these testimonies offer a unique and intimate look into the lived experiences of soldiers, civilians, and African Americans who faced the brutality of conflict. Stories told by descendants of veterans or the formerly enslaved offer a human element that is often lost in larger historical narratives. The importance of oral reports is not only in recapitulating events, but also in transmitting teachings and lessons generated by pain and achievements. Furthermore, these stories help connect generations, allowing young people to understand the realities of the past in a deeper way. Initiatives to collect and preserve these stories have become a way of reinforcing the cultural identity of communities and, at the same time, creating a legacy that perpetuates the fight for freedom and equality, making them an essential tool in education and in the construction of collective memory. The American Civil War, with its profound divisions and social transformations, shaped the contemporary United States in ways that still reverberate in society today. The conflict not only resulted in the abolition of slavery, but also instigated essential questions about civil rights and equality that continue to be debated. The struggle for emancipation laid the groundwork for later movements for equality, such as the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, which sought to give voice to the demands of African Americans and other marginalized communities. Furthermore, the traumas and experiences lived during the war and its consequences generated a new national identity, where the search for freedom and social justice became a fundamental pillar of the American narrative. The legacy of the war has influenced politics, culture, and social interactions, creating a society that, although still facing inequalities, is engaged in the search for a more just and equal future. Therefore, despite the divisions that arose at the time, the Civil War presents itself as a crucial moment that triggered profound and lasting changes in the trajectory of the USA, conditioning its social, political, and cultural relations to this day. Race relations in the contemporary United States reveal a complex panorama marked by significant advances but also by persistent challenges. Since the abolition of slavery, the nation has struggled to implement ideals of equality that the Civil War promised. Institutions such as the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were important milestones in the fight against racial discrimination. But in practice, many African Americans still face systemic and social barriers. Issues such as police brutality, racial justice movements, and the continued fight for equality and opportunities reflect a context of tension in today's society. Furthermore, the resistance of certain groups to these changes and current discrimination policies reveal that the fight for fair racial relations is far from won. However, new generations are increasingly engaged in understanding and combating these injustices, joining social movements to promote change. Thus, race relations today become not only a reflection of the nation's past, but also an ongoing battleground for equity and social justice. Discussions about the historical legacies of the Civil War have gained notoriety in contemporary debates, especially in relation to the way history is remembered and interpreted. Monuments and statues honoring Confederate leaders have become symbols of controversy and division in communities, leading to questions about the glorification of figures associated with the defense of slavery. While some argue that these monuments represent the heritage and courage of their predecessors, others see them as a denial of fundamental human rights and a perpetuation of oppression. The fight for a more inclusive narrative, which celebrates not only war heroes but also the voices of the oppressed, has intensified. Museums, school, curricula, and cultural exhibitions are adjusting to reflect the complexity of history, recognizing both the tragedies and the triumphs. These discussions are fundamental to building a collective memory that promotes healing and unity, overcoming legacies of pain and division. Thus, debates about the historical legacies of the Civil War are shaping the present and drawing perspectives for a more just and inclusive future. The future of Civil War memories in the United States will undoubtedly be a reflection of ever-evolving social and political changes. As society becomes more aware of persistent injustices and inequalities, how the Civil War and its legacies are remembered and discussed will become a central element in the national narrative. The challenge will be to balance the preservation of history with the need to confront the darker aspects of the past, ensuring that memories of war serve not only as a reflection on brutality and sacrifice, but also as a catalyst for change. Efforts to re-evaluate monuments, revamp educational curricula, and integrate marginalized voices into war narratives promise a more inclusive and representative memory. Community organizations, educators, and historians will play a vital role in promoting a dialogue that does not erase the past, but that offers opportunities for understanding and reconciliation. In this way, memories of the Civil War can be transformed into a legacy of unity and social justice, shaping not only the future of American history but also the nation's collective identity. The lessons learned from the American Civil War remain relevant and discussed today. One of the most important teachings is the need to understand the costs of division and hostility. The war not only resulted in the loss of lives, but also left deep scars on families and entire communities. History has shown that open and respectful dialogue is crucial to resolving conflicts. Rather than seeking solutions from a space of confrontation, states, leaders, and citizens must learn that true strength lies in the ability to listen and consider the perspectives of others. Furthermore, lessons about the importance of equality and human rights were fundamental. What began as a fight to preserve the Union culminated in the fight to recognize the humanity of all citizens, regardless of the color of their skin. Therefore, the history of the Civil War is a constant reminder that the pursuit of justice must be ongoing and that unity and inclusion are essential to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. The need for unification became evident after the Civil War, when America found itself divided by open wounds and resentment, the Reconstruction process offered a unique opportunity for the nation to regain its sense of identity as a true and cohesive union. Thus, the challenge was not only to rebuild the economy and infrastructure, but also to recover the soul of the nation. Unification required the inclusion of African Americans in society, recognizing their vital role in the fight for freedom. For America to become a place where everyone could prosper, it was necessary to work across ethnic, social, and political divides in the name of a shared ideal of freedom and justice. Reconciliation required an open dialogue between the victorious and the vanquished, where each voice could be heard and their pain validated. Only through building an inclusive citizenship and promoting values of empathy and mutual respect could the nation heal and move forward as a whole. The path would not be easy, but it was essential to guarantee lasting peace. Hopes for the future after the Civil War were unique and filled with expectation, but they were also intertwined with fear of the uncertainties that were yet to come. The desire for a world where equality and civil rights were assured was palpable, leading the African American community and its allies to believe in unprecedented possibilities. The promise of a new beginning was related not only to emancipation, but also to the transformation of mentalities and the fight for justice. However, the realization of these hopes would depend on society's ability to confront issues related to systemic racism and socioeconomic inequality. The ideals of freedom, dignity, and full rights were sown, but the harvest would require persistence and courage. With the emergence of new social movements and the growing awareness of the general population, a new era of commitment to human rights began to take shape, inspiring future generations to keep the desires for freedom and equality alive. Hopes for the future, therefore, were not merely utopian, but constituted a continuous struggle to build a more just world. The importance of empathy in the history of the American Civil War is immeasurable and reveals itself as a powerful tool for reconciliation and building a better future. The ability to understand the experiences and traumas that others have experienced is essential to healing the wounds of the past. During and after the war, a deep understanding of the pain that slavery caused was required. The untold stories of people who fought and died in the name of their beliefs can serve as guidance in the search for shared humanity. Empathy allows each of us to recognize that although we may have different perspectives, we are all part of the same narrative. Promoting a safe space for victimized voices to be heard is a necessary condition for inclusion and acceptance. Today, the continuity of the legacy of the Civil War requires acceptance of differences, allowing each story to be integrated into our collective history, showing that true unity comes from recognition and respect for diversity. Learning to look at the past through the lens of empathy can guide us towards a future where justice is more than a distant ideal, but a reality accessible to all. The American Civil War teaches us that the fight for justice and equality is ongoing, and that empathy and understanding the experiences of others are fundamental to healing the wounds of the past and building a more just and united future. We would like to hear from you. Which American Civil War narrative would you like to explore in depth? Is there a figure or event that piques your interest? How do you believe the history of the American Civil War still influences race and social relations today? What lessons do you consider most relevant to addressing current divisions? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss upcoming videos as we continue to explore America's rich and complex history.